Hi there, and welcome to One Idea Away, not just a podcast, but a community and ongoing conversation meant to inspire and empower individuals to live more fully, deeply, and consciously. Let's jump into today's episode right now. What's it all for? What's your life about? For many, they've taken up the cause and even the pursuit of happiness, but it hasn't always panned out. In fact, at times, the very pursuit of happiness can make you unhappy. And even if you do get that chance to experience more happiness in your life, at times you get there and you feel like something's missing. Well, that's part of what drove today's guest to dig deeper and to consider, what does this really mean for us? So this is going to be an episode devoted to really investigating what really matters. Our guest today is Emily Esfahani Smith. She's a journalist and the author of The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Criterion, and many other publications. She's also an editor at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where she advises the Ben Franklin Circles Project, a collaboration with the 92nd Street Y and Citizen University to build meaning in local communities. With that, Emily, thank you so much for joining us on One Idea Away.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm curious, what is it that you believe, before we even shift into the full conversation of meaning, what do you believe just brought about this surge and interest in the pursuit of happiness? I mean, certainly Martin Seligman introduced this as a major field approximately 20 years ago, but it obviously tapped into something. What do you think that was?
I think you're right. I think that there's a few things going on. So, Western civilization, Western culture has always been interested in the pursuit of happiness, going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle, asking, how can you lead a flourishing life, onwards up to today. And so this idea that, happiness or well-being or flourishing should be at the center of our lives is kind of been in the conversation. And at different points in Western history, the idea was that, yes, you should pursue happiness, or no, you shouldn't pursue happiness. Happiness is for the hereafter. And now here we are again today. And I think we're really living with the legacy of Enlightenment thinkers who, during the Enlightenment, the idea of happiness changed to basically mean maximizing your positive emotions, feeling good, and minimizing negative emotions and feeling bad. Whereas in the past, the idea of happiness was much more in line with what I talk about being a meaningful life. So like where you're kind of doing things, living according to your virtues. And so we're kind of living with that legacy. And then, I think when positive psychology came around, it just caused this explosion, and it tapped into two things. One, I think, is this just natural interest that our culture has in science and scientific explanations for things, that it's only valid if there's scientific evidence behind it. And of course, positive psychology is a social science. It's purporting to give you scientific answers to how to lead a happier life. And I also think that there's this bigger, emptiness and spiritual void that people were struggling with, especially in the absence of organized religion being at the center of our lives, the center of our culture, and the way that it used to be. Less people say that they're religious, go to church, pray, and religion is not the only one of these traditional sources of meaning that's kind of evaporated from daily life, tradition, communities, and I think that has kind of caused just a sense of kind of chaos and of spiritual emptiness among people. And as they try to figure out how to satisfy that existential vacuum, happiness just seems like the obvious response, because of course, who doesn't want to be happy? We all want to be happy. And, even Aristotle is translated as saying that the whole point and purpose of life is for human beings to pursue happiness. And so I think that was playing into it as well. And, I'll argue, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, that kind of pursuit of happiness hijacked what is the thing that can actually satisfy that spiritual void, which is, searching for meaning.
Yeah. And I absolutely do want us to turn to there in just that second. One of the other things that I think was also incredibly intriguing about some of what you present in that pursuit of happiness is that as nations have pursued this, as nations have even gotten wealthier and all of this other stuff that looks like it should be positive, we really haven't seen a general state of improvement. Stress levels are still at an all-time high. Unfulfillment, disengagement, all of these are still at all times high. And I think that's what led, and I'd love for you to then expand on this, is that sense of maybe what has been perceived as the happiness movement has certainly not delivered on its promise. If you could say more about that, because that's one of the premises that you certainly present in the book.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that what is, there's this promise that happiness is going to solve our problems. And when in fact, happiness is a positive emotion. It's something that comes and goes. And the research shows that when you value happiness and prioritize it the way that our culture is constantly encouraging us to do, that you actually end up feeling less happy. The pursuit of happiness can actually make you unhappy. And a separate study shows that people who kind of do this, they also feel lonelier as a result of it. And what's really interesting, though, is that, when you look at the research and you try to figure out, okay, what is driving this, this decades-long rise in depression and anxiety and suicide, and what the research, pretty clearly shows is that it's not a lack of happiness in people's lives. It's a lack of meaning. And so we think that happiness is the solution, but it's not the solution. The solution is meaning. And so we're kind of chasing the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, just as we begin to turn to that part of the conversation, the one thing I'm also still interested in, though, is how did you get interested in this? Meaning, what was it that kind of drew you into this field, drew you into this specific research?
I talk in my book a little bit about how I grew up living in a Sufi meeting house, and Sufism is this school of mysticism. Living in the meeting house meant that twice a week people were coming over, sitting on the floor in this kind of big meditation hall that I'm sure the previous owners used as a living room. And, they were meditating, for several hours a night. And the point of their practice was to kind of diminish their sense of self and grow closer to this higher reality that, we call God. And involved in their practice was also, practicing loving kindness and service to, all and to all of creation. Because the idea is if you kind of, love God, then you love all of his creation and everything that's in it. And, a lot of these Sufis had led really hard lives. Some of them were refugees from the Middle East. Others were Westerners who had been beaten up by life in other ways. And, for them, it wasn't about pursuing happiness. It was about finding comfort and contentment in a spiritual practice that was pretty demanding, but that left them with this kind of sense of peacefulness and of meaningfulness, and that helped them make sense of their own suffering and the suffering of the people that they loved. And so I think that really stayed with me. And, as I grew older and left home, I began to wonder, okay, can you find meaning outside of a religious and spiritual context? If so, what does that look like? And around that same time, I just started noticing that there was so much cultural pressure to be happy all the time. And that when I reflected back on the, people I grew up with, that wasn't what their life was about. And that this happiness zeitgeist almost kind of belittled the lives of people who weren't so interested in kind of maximizing their own happiness. To me, one of the things the happiness zeitgeist says is, if you aren't happy, then there's something wrong with you, that your life is less valuable for whatever reason. And that just wasn't my experience, my personal experience, and also the experience that I had lived with these other people. And so as I was on that journey, trying to figure some of this stuff out, I decided to study philosophy. And then I came across positive psychology. And it was really studying positive psychology. I wrote some articles about this new research on meaning and happiness. And then those really kind of went viral, to my surprise. But that suggested to me that there was a yearning for this message out there. And And so I explored it further and ended up writing the book.
Excellent. Because I think that is, what you started to tap into. And I think it's a really important part of the evolution of this positive psychology conversation is that it is enriching it, deepening it to include more than just what most people may understand as the happiness element of it. Mm-hmm. And if maybe that, let's use that then to kick off, because I'd love to share some of those elements, obviously, that you have been finding. But if we kick off with, if you could make that clear distinction of, the happy life versus the meaningful life, so that people can really understand the depth of what you're describing.
Yeah, of course. So different people, you'll find 100 different definitions of happiness if you talk to 100 different people, especially people who are working, within philosophy and positive psychology. But when I kind of looked at the research and looked across the writings, it seemed clear to me that when people talk about happiness, what they're really talking about is feeling good in the moment, enjoying life, a life of comfort and ease, what psychologists define as a positive mental and emotional state. So if you feel good, you're happy. If you feel bad, you're unhappy. It's that big yellow smiley face, on all of those articles about happiness. And it's how most psychologists and philosophers define it as well. And certainly that's how it's defined in the research within positive psychology. Meaning, though, is different. So meaning is about connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself, something bigger than you are alone. And when people say their lives are meaningful, it's because they have these three, they believe the following three things about their lives. First, they believe that their lives have significance and worth. Second, they believe that their lives have a sense of purpose, so some goal that kind of drives them forward. And finally, they believe their lives are coherent, so their lives make sense to them.
Interesting. So let's because a couple of the other things that you also have I saw in the research that you were drawing on was that as we begin to pursue more of the happy life as opposed to the meaningful one in the way that you're describing it, is that the happy life seemed to be more associated with this idea of taking, as you described, taking for the moment to feel good in the moment, and that the pursuit of the meaningful one was more associated with the idea of giving. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think this connection that is part of these elements of meaning, of significance and worth, purpose and coherence, there's an interesting connection there to this giving element as well.
Yeah. So no doubt about it that the meaningful life is about giving to others, about serving others. I mean, that's, if you think about the definition of stepping outside of yourself and connecting to something beyond, kind of this giving nature is inherent in it. And happiness, I don't want it to sound like all people who pursue happiness or who are happy are more selfish, and that's certainly not true. But I think that when you have this mindset of I have to advance my own happiness, I need to feel good. Like the very definition of happiness is kind of a self-oriented one, because it's about how you feel in the present moment. And so I think that's why it's associated with behaviors like being more of a taker. Just think about it. There's a study that I write about where they had people go out and pursue happiness for 10 days or pursue meaning for 10 days. And the people in the happiness group did things like sleeping in, playing games, going to the spa, eating ice cream, whereas people in the meaning group did things like visiting a sick relative in the hospital, volunteering, studying harder for a test because it would help them accomplish some bigger goal. So I think that we see that distinction in these activities that people do when you tell them go out and do this versus that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so part of what then I wanted to shift us into is this idea, because as I've talked about meaning before on the show, and certainly there is a very personal element of what it is that we'd consider to be meaningful. And what was very intriguing to be able to see within your book is that while that may be true, there are certain universal patterns or sources that we can learn from, that we can really begin to draw from. And so I wanted to get into, for everybody, the four sources that Emily gets into of belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence. Maybe if we could just begin a little bit with each one on belonging, because I think the other piece that you just brought up a little while ago in terms of maybe some of the breakdown of some of the social structures and meeting places and religion places and things like that we've previously sought belonging aren't where people are seeking it now. And so I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on, what does it mean to belong, and how is that related to us feeling like we are connecting to a meaningful life?
Right. So belonging, I think belonging, it's a concept that we associate with groups, like you belong to a community, you belong to a family. But belonging is really, it can exist in a group, but it's also a feature of your individual relationships. And what it means to belong is to be in a relationship or a part of a group where you feel valued for who you are intrinsically, and where you value others for who they are as well. And, you can imagine being in a relationship. Maybe you've been in one, maybe some of your listeners have been in relationships or part of groups like this, where you're in a relationship and there's kind of, you're dating somebody, or it's your relationship to your parents or to siblings or to friends or whatever. And they kind of devalue you. They make you feel rejected. They don't accept you for who you are. They tease you about this and that. They give you the silent treatment, which makes you feel kind of invisible and unworthy. And, those kinds of relationships tend to be really toxic. And the reason why is because they don't satisfy this yearning we all have for belonging. There's a famous paper in psychology published like 20 years ago called The Need to Belong. We have this need for belonging that's fundamental for our survival. And research is now showing also for us feeling like our lives are meaningful. There's really interesting studies that show that when you bring people into the lab and you make them feel rejected, like you tell them, you have them meet like a bunch of people, and then afterwards you tell some of them, of the people you met, nobody wants to spend more time with you. And then you tell the other group, like, of the people you met, everyone wants to spend more time with you. So the rejected people not only rate their lives as less meaningful, but they rate life in general as less meaningful. So there's this powerful connection between you, like, other people treating you like you matter, and then believing that your life matters.
So much of what we do from week to week on One Idea Away are explore different ideas and insights and stories that I can tell you have personally and professionally affected my own life, my own career. I also know that these are the ideas and the insights that have affected many others, people that I've worked with, from actual direct clients of mine to coaches that I know that are out there that are doing this work, to obviously the work and the stories that so many of our experts and guests share right here on the show. And so we've begun some new things new developments inside of the One Idea Away community. And you might be missing out on some of these added reflections and insights that we've been doing, as well as some of the deeper conversations we're getting into. So if you are not presently receiving our email messages, or if you're not part of our private Facebook group conversations, then I'm going to ask you to get involved so that you're not missing out on some of the weekly momentum building reflections and questions that we keep throwing out, some of the inspiration and encouragement of the community, because there's really nothing like having somebody in your corner while you're trying to make some of these types of changes. We've even begun some regular live streaming so that we can go deeper into these topics. Just go over to oneideaaway.com/join to get involved. Now, don't worry, it's free. Just jump on in at oneideaaway.com/join. It's part of our mission at One Idea Way to take these insights, the wisdom that's gained, and begin to use them so that we can springboard to live more fully, deeply, and consciously. As I said, these are the ideas and insights that have changed my own lives and the lives of so many more. And if you want to know how exactly, if you want to know how you can begin to tap into some of these ideas and make those shifts within your life, well, do me a favor, just go over to oneideaaway.com/join, get on the email, stop in the side of the community, and please come ask me. I would love to have that conversation with you, as well as get you involved to make whatever changes, whatever shifts in your life you're looking to make. Because at the end of the day, it just takes one idea for us to really start to uncover what this life can be all about for us. Thanks for dropping in, and enjoy the rest of the episode. I've also seen some of the other research that's out there. One that was really interesting that I saw just a little while ago is even that idea of when you are connected to a friend and walking up a hill, you actually perceive the hill to be less steep. And it, just that sense of when we are in belonging, that view of life, that view of whatever's in front of us, it just seems to, whether it be more meaningful or a little easier or whatever, that sense of belonging really surrounds us. And I think the other aspect, which you also went into in the book around this, which I think is intriguing, is that you describe that we almost have this age of isolation that's going on, which is probably making it even more pronounced as to why we have and want and desire this sense of belonging. Could you say a little bit more about that age of isolation that we seem to be in?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's, people more than ever feel lonelier. There's, I think the most the saddest statistic out there is that 20 years ago, if you asked people how many confidants do you have, they said something like 3. Today, if you ask people how many confidants you have, the most common response is 0. People are talking to their neighbors less. Communities are dissolving. Some of these kind of interpersonal skills, such as empathy, are on the decline. I think there's a study out there showing that, over the last 30 years, rates of empathy have declined among college students 40%. And so there's this real sense of kind of aloneness and isolation. And it's really dangerous because the research shows that it can literally kill you. I mean, there are really problematic health effects to this. And it goes back to what I was saying before, which is that we have this need to belong, which is kind of a physical, psychological need, but it's also an existential need.
Yeah. What did you see then within some of this research? What might be an example of one or two things that people are doing to begin that outreach again? Meaning that in the absence of maybe some of the things that used to bring us together, what are we doing, can we be doing to feel that connection, that belonging in a way that maybe has been absent for us at a level of depth?
I'll tell you about one of the things that I'm involved with, which I really love and I think is exciting. It's called the Ben Franklin Circles Project. And it's this initiative of the 92nd Street Y in New York, which is this wonderful cultural institution in New York, kind of a storied institution. And it's also supported by the Hoover Institution and the Citizen University in Seattle. And, the background is, Ben Franklin, when he was a young man in Philadelphia, he was trying to make something of his life. And he decided to start a group called the Junto. Junto is a Latin word that means to bind together, I believe. And so this group was just other kind of tradesmen in the community, and they came together either once a week or once a month, I can't remember. Over the course of several decades, they sustained this group, and Franklin called it a mutual improvement society. So the idea was that they would come and they would kind of improve themselves and also improve the world around them. And it was a very generative group. So they helped each other. They talked about things like the virtues. Franklin had these 13 virtues that he thought was the basis of a good life. They would present papers they were working on. They would, talk to each other about their problems, but they also contributed to their community. And, one side of this isolation phenomenon that we're experiencing today is the decline of civic engagement. And so the people in Franklin's circle, Franklin's Junto, they came together and they created Philadelphia's first free public library. They started the fire brigade. All of these needs that were in the community, because it was such a new community, they found ways to satisfy them. And so the Ben Franklin circles today are kind of inspired by a similar idea. The idea is that, you come together in these small groups of, 10 or 12 people, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, and you have conversations about what really matter. And, the idea is that you improve yourself and that you improve the world around you. So the way, there are dozens of these around the country, and anybody can start one. I started one here in Washington, D.C., and each meeting we take one of Franklin's 13 virtues. So, for example, silence or humility or industriousness, and we talk about the role of that virtue in our life, how we might want to shore up that virtue in our lives, strengthen it, and the role of that virtue in society at large, whether it has a role or not. And so it's been really nice. It's been a nice community. And what's been really interesting about it is that it's kind of, it was more or less a group of strangers coming together to do this. People wrote into the Ben Franklin Circle's website, and anyone who who was in DC, I reached out to them, and we started this thing. We come together and we talk about the problems we're facing, some of the challenges we have, but also things that happened in our lives that went well, things we're hoping for, how we want to improve ourselves and improve our communities. And it's created this real sense of intimacy and belonging among us. And what's great is that these circles, there are dozens of them across the US now, and anybody can start one. I started one just by, figuring out who was interested in here in DC and bringing, a group of strangers together, really. But now it's turned into this really special, meaningful thing that is kind of satisfying this yearning for belonging. So I think there are ways to find belonging, if you kind of are willing to take the initiative and put yourself out there. The other thing I'd say is recognizing that any interaction you have with any other person is an opportunity to cultivate belonging. So if you're walking by somebody, instead of averting your eyes, smiling, saying hello, having a conversation with the person checking you out at the grocery store, these are ways to kind of have little micro moments of connection too.
And it's amazing. I really appreciate that you brought that part up too as well, because it's amazing how that can begin to snowball into being a little bit more outgoing, how you can reach out that little bit more. And it begins to build that as, a little bit of confidence for you, maybe even a little bit of momentum for you to then maybe start something a little bit bigger. And certainly what you described with the Ben Franklin circles even conjures up more out of the personal development space, what Napoleon Hill had popularized through all the years of a mastermind group. But with the Ben Franklin circles, I love the idea of the exploration of both the virtues as well as the civic mindedness as well. Because it ties in some of these other elements of meaning that you're also talking about, not just the belonging element. I guess as I just wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions then on some of these other elements that you describe in the book. If I kind of cut a little bit ahead on purpose, purpose certainly being something, and for everybody, it's that idea. It's something that's stable. It's a far-reaching goal, but it's also something that you feel like you're contributing to something bigger than yourself. And I guess the question I really wanted to ask you on this idea of purpose is that I think a lot of people would say, I really want to have that. I want to cultivate that in my life. And at the same time, I'm wrestling with, I got to pay the bills. I'm working for a company that I may not enjoy, a job that I may not enjoy. How do they reconcile that? How can they bring that purpose to wherever they happen to be right now?
Right. So I think that purpose is one of these ideas that gets really played up in our culture, so much so that it's up on this pedestal. And we think about purpose as this big thing, like I need to find my one capital P purpose in life. And that once I do, all my problems will be solved. And so, some people may have that, and that's great, but not everybody will. There's only 1/3 of people see their jobs as a calling. And, for the rest of us, I don't think that means that we're doomed to never feel a sense of purpose, but I think it just means that we need to think a little bit more creatively about what purpose is. So, I talked to so many parents who told me that their purpose is raising their children. I talked to a hospital cleaner who told me her purpose is helping sick people get better. And, so what does that tell you? It tells you that even doesn't matter it does matter to a certain extent, but it's not what you do day to day, the actual tasks of your job. Even if you don't necessarily enjoy them, you can connect them to something higher and therefore make them seem worthwhile in the grand scheme of things. Or you can say, my purpose, maybe my job is just a job, and that's okay. And it's a salary for me, and it allows me to satisfy these other roles and purposes that are important to me, like being, a good parent, a good spouse, or pursuing hobbies on the side that I can do because I have this job that allows me to support myself. So, bringing purpose down to earth a little bit and realizing that it doesn't have to be tied to the work that you do. But if you do want to find purpose in your work, going back to what we talked about earlier, adopting a service mindset could be really helpful. So figuring out how what you do gives to others in some way, whether it's others that are served by the institution you work for, or whether it's your colleagues. Can you be more helpful at work? Can you cultivate relationships? The role you play in whatever domain of life you are in will determine how much purpose you have.
It's interesting because I know when I've considered some of these things in the past and I've gotten into some of these conversations, one of those thoughts that comes into mind, and I really appreciate that connection to bringing the service mindedness into what you're doing. Part of one of those classic examples is what Zappos did. They were selling shoes, but they turned their business. The belief of the business was that they were in the service business, and so it changes the orientation of what you are doing and how you understand what you may be part of.
Yeah.
So being able to take that, whether it be higher perspective or different perspective, and connecting it to something that's more core to the difference you want to make, the values that you may have, you can do that in most all environments. I won't say all, because there's certainly some that may not be conducive to that, but in most all environments. Right. One of the, so one of these other traits, because I think these first three of belonging, purpose, and then storytelling, which I'm going to ask you about, feed into what you described before of that when we have a meaningful life, there's that significance and worth. Certainly we can see that in belonging. Purpose, very directly correlated. And then coherence, I know, is tied into storytelling. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on storytelling, because it was an interesting way of describing the connection that storytelling has to meaning. But when you tied it to coherence, all of a sudden it started to kind of make a lot of sense and fall into place as to what this means.
Right. So storytelling is about, the story that you tell yourself, about how you became the person that you are today. And, this pillar of meaning, I think when I talk to people about it, it surprises them. And I think it's because we don't always realize that we have this ongoing narrative about who we are that's playing in our mind at all times. It's like if you wake up in the morning and you sleep in and then you can't find your keys and then you slip on the ice, like going to your car, you start telling the story about how you can never get anything right, how you're always messing up. This is why no one likes you. This is why you can't get married. And, and then it's like that colors like the rest of your day, your week, or whatever. Versus, considering that those are three data points. You woke up late, you lost your keys, you fall. What about all the other kind of data points that you're not considering, that you're not weaving into the story? Like, the fact that you helped a homeless person like get a meal the day before, or, and that's why you slept in because you were up so late, whatever the case may be. So I get this question all the time of, well, isn't that just deceiving yourself about who you are? And I think it's in fact the opposite, because human beings have a really strong negativity bias. So we're more likely to remember negative things, to dwell on negative things, to respond to negative things. And if that's the case, then that means that we're more likely to also focus on the negative when we're crafting our own stories. And so I think we need to correct for that by focusing and being true to like the good things that happen in our lives as well. And the reason that's important is because the story that you tell affects how you live your life. It can empower you to live with more meaning, or it can hold you back. I mean, people who tell these more negative stories about their lives tend to be more anxious and depressed and to feel that their lives are less meaningful, versus people who tell kind of these more positive, hopeful stories about their lives that are defined by themes like love and growth and redemption.
That's a really key point as well, because those stories are reinforcing. And so if our narrative is taking us in one direction, if it's playing off of the negativity bias, that's going to dictate a lot of, or certainly shape a lot of how we end up showing up, which is going to give us more ammunition for the story that we're already telling. And so to be able to consciously look at your narrative, and exactly as you say, if we know that we already have this predisposition to trend towards negativity for survival instincts and stress response, all the other stuff that's back there, it's something that we can correct for, but it's something to be conscious of, because we do need to do that with intention. Just before we begin to bring this around full circle, I guess this last quality is the one that I also wanted to bring up, because we've talked about belonging, purpose, and storytelling, and how all of that works very well with what you described before of significance, worth, purpose, and coherence. And you then bring up this fourth quality of transcendence. And that's a kind of a big 50-cent word that many people would probably equate more to the pursuit of spirituality and mindfulness and those types of things. And here it is in, psychology, science, research-based book. And so I was wondering if you could break down that concept of transcendence, and how does that play a role within our sense of meaning?
So I'll say this, so transcendence, yes, like it's definitely associated with religious experiences, spirituality, mystical experiences, but there is kind of a rich tradition within psychology of investigating these experiences empirically and trying to understand what they tell us. I mean, these experiences are kind of, it's incontrovertible that people have these experiences and that people who have them, whether they believe in God or not, a lot of atheists have them as well, that these experiences change them profoundly, and that people who have these experiences rate them as among the most meaningful of their lives. So what is a transcendent experience? It's an experience where you basically feel like you're lifted above the hustle and bustle of daily life. You're lifted outside of your own head. Your sense of self starts to dissolve, and you feel connected to something much bigger. So, maybe that happens for you in meditation. Maybe it happens for you when you go to church, or maybe it happens, out in nature, seeing the Grand Canyon, seeing the stars at night, and just contemplating on how old the universe is, how tiny we are in the face of it all. It's these experiences of awe where you encounter something much bigger than yourself, and it frightens you a little bit, but it also makes your life, it also kind of redeems your life, because even though you feel so small, people say that they also feel connected to something much bigger than themselves. And so feeling a part of something bigger is really what makes that it makes the experience so meaningful to them. And when they come down from the experience, their lives change. People report kind of being more oriented to others, caring less about their own ambition, their own pursuits, saying that they've come back with this wisdom, the experience imparted wisdom and insight onto them. And so it's very interesting, and it's very mysterious. And I think that you can't really talk about meaning without addressing these kinds of experiences. They're some would argue these experiences are the very basis of religion and spirituality, which for thousands of years have been kind of so central to the human experience, and in many parts of the world still is. Yeah.
Well, I think it's been fascinating to see how some of this was connected. I'm glad you brought up that thought of awe, but fascinating to see the study and the science that have gone into these transcendent experiences and gone into this recognition of who we are, what we are in connection to these awesome states that we do experience. And it is something for those that, whether, if you're into meditation, those types of practices, fantastic. If that is not something that you've gotten into or hasn't, connected for you, to be able to look at nature, to be able to look at what are those experiences that connect you to that sense of awe, and that give you then that connection to, wow, there's something really, really big out here. It's an incredible way to be able to tap into what you're describing, and it stays with you and has a very, very interesting impact on our lives. I guess then, Emily, to kind of bring us around a bit full circle, I'm also kind of curious then for you, given where you are now on your journey and all that, that you've been researching and diving into the middle of, I'm curious, what is it matters most to you at this point in your life?
I think undoubtedly my relationships to other people, to my family, my friends, it's very important to me. I think that the work that I do, the sense of purpose that I derive from telling the stories of others, from writing, from connecting to others through my writing is also very important. And tapping into the pillar of transcendence as well. I think that when I go too long without having some sort of transcendent experience, I really feel an emptiness. And so making sure that I'm making time for that.
Yeah. Emily, I want to thank you so much for joining us on One Idea Way, and for everything you've been able to share and the incredible work that you're up to.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Excellent. For everyone, of course, I do want to recommend, check out The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. It's a really, truly a wonderful book, and a tremendous amount of insights, as well as you can hear, some really practical ways of taking this into your life. And that's really what I want to encourage you to do, is that when we do turn our lives towards meaning, and however that's going to take shape through some of these common sources that we can draw, and some of the things that will also come up for us, is that it is a conscious journey. It's a conscious exploration. It's things that we want to be intentional about, reflecting on, and deciding, how do we bring this out more in our lives? That's ultimately how you create a life of meaning. It's how you bring more of that fulfillment as well as that happiness and that joy and that peace, all of that together into your life. And so I encourage you to check out the book. I encourage you to look at this type of conversation from a very intentional, conscious viewpoint. And once again, I want to thank you for dropping in on One Idea Away. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.